Okay, so again, welcome. Let me just kind of introduce Matt McBride with CitySquare. His family moved to Dallas in 1990 by way of Abilene Christian University. He was a student minister for 12 years and started volunteering at CitySquare at that point. And he must have quickly found a love of the organization because he's still there. He was managing the food pantry operation, and that's where he oversaw kind of what's near and dear to our heart, distribution of over 5.5 million pounds of food to nearly 20,000 households in the DFW area. In December of 2018, Matt was given the annual the CitySquare Award, which the CitySquare Way. It's an award of executive leadership. Matt has since joined the office of the president at CitySquare and oversees all of community relations. So Matt and his family with 3 boys lives in Coppell, and we'll turn it over to him to help us understand more about the organization and what will kind of kick off our affiliate committee fundraising goal for CitySquare, which we will from today forward throughout the remainder of the year share on all of our social media to really do what we do best, is raise money for our community. So Matt, take it away.
Thank you, Francie. I appreciate it. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for letting me be here and spend some time with you and talk about CitySquare and to talk about this issue of poverty here in Dallas. Now, while the issue of poverty is not unique to Dallas, it is unique in Dallas, right? Because so much of our city is experiencing the growth of these Fortune 500 companies that are coming and placing their headquarters in our city, and we're one of the top major cities in how many companies are coming and placing their headquarters in our Metroplex. At the same time, Dallas is also one of the highest rated major cities for raising childhood rate of poverty. And so there's this tale of two cities where you can drive through certain parts of our city and think everything's going really well, drive through other parts of our city, specifically the southern and the eastern parts of our city, and our neighbors are not getting the benefit of a lot of that economic growth like certain neighbors are in different parts of our city. So we want to try to take advantage of opportunities like this with friends like you to tell the story of what it's like in different parts of our neighborhood and what this issue of poverty is and how we step into that fight on behalf of our neighbors. So CitySquare is an organization that exists to fight the causes and the effects of poverty. And that's really important because in order for us to be effective at addressing and dealing and hopefully solving this issue of poverty, we have to figure out how did we get here in the first place. And so a lot of the conversations that we've been having over the 30 years that we've been fighting poverty are similar to conversations that our country is just starting to have really intensely over the last 12, 18, 24 months, right? Specifically around social injustice, racial equity. Those things are conversations that we've been having as we've studied the historical systemic racism that is perpetrated a lot of parts of our society that we didn't really understand or acknowledge what it was in the moment, and realize we're having to undo decades and decades of oppression for many of our friends and neighbors in our city, and that it's not just going to take, some bill or some law or some government support system that's all of a sudden going to undo all of that decades worth of work to oppress people. And so we have to think, how do we do that? How long is this going to take? This isn't something that's, we're just going to be able to snap our fingers and take care of. So a part of that is stepping into the conversation with people that are just starting to have these conversations and walking alongside people. It's not just CitySquare elevating its voice, it's elevating other voices in this time right now. And we'll talk about that here a little bit more as we get into advocacy, because we fight the causes and the effects of poverty, and we do it through service, advocacy, and friendship. And so the first thing that I want you to understand is we believe in what we call the wealth of the poor at CitySquare, which basically means we believe that everybody's rich and everybody's poor, just in different ways. So just because you have a lot of wealth doesn't necessarily mean you have everything. And just because you may not have any wealth doesn't mean you're not of value. And so we call that the wealth of the poor. Another tenet that we believe is we believe the people closest to the problems have the best solutions. And so the experts in poverty are not the people that fight poverty, it's the people that live in it every single day. The experts in food insecurity, which is you just don't know where your next meal is going to come from, are the people that are food insecure. The experts in homelessness are not necessarily emergency adult shelters or affordable housing organizations. It's the people that live underneath I-45 near Deep Ellum. So we believe in the people closest to the problems have the best solutions, and they're the experts in poverty. So if we're going to address this issue of poverty, we need to know them. They need to be in the room. They need to be at the table. They need to be the ones that are helping us come up with solutions for addressing these issues, because nobody knows it better than our friends and our neighbors that experience poverty. And I need to drill that home just so that I make sure that we're on the same page, because there's a difference in how you describe a homeless person and a person that's experiencing homelessness. And that variation may be really subtle. If you say a homeless person, an image comes into your mind, but if you say a person that's experiencing homelessness, maybe that image kind of takes on a little bit of a different form. And so that's really important to us, because these are people that experience something that's happening to them, not necessarily a personification of an issue, if that makes sense. Because people come first at CitySquare. We fight poverty through service, advocacy, and friendship. And we have 17, 18 programs that fight all the complex issues of poverty, but it's not because we had a company retreat and stood in front of a dry erase board and came up with all these solutions. It's because our neighbors came to us early on when we started a food pantry in 1988, and they said, you know what, it's not really helpful to be handed a bag of stuff that's already put together, because there may be stuff in the bag I don't like, or I don't need, or I don't know what to do with, or especially with our neighbors experiencing poverty, that there may be some medical issues. Hypertension, high blood pressure are a big deal with our neighbors that are in poverty. Type 1 diabetes is another big deal. Allergies are across the board. So, you know, there may be some medical reasons why they can't just accept everything that we hand to them. Well, there's a lot of wisdom in that. And so we went to a client choice food pantry, grocery store style of food distribution before it became a thing. And not because CitySquare is amazing at what we do. We are amazing at what we do, but it's because of the proximity, the trust, the relationship, the inclusion, and the advocacy that we have for our friends and our neighbors that experience poverty. And they're the ones that influence what we do. Our neighbors came to us early on, about 20 years ago, and said, you know, one thing that we need is we need legal representation in civil matters. If it's a criminal issue, the city, the county, the state will provide representation for you. But if I'm trying to get custody of my granddaughter, or if I'm trying to get child support back pay from an absentee father, or if we're trying to deal with some immigration issues, or especially right now with eviction prevention right now, you're on your own for legal representation. And so our neighbors came to us and said, we need help. This is a big deal. So we developed a law program, Legal Action Works. It's our law program. It's 4 full-time lawyers that represent our neighbors on legal matters like immigration, eviction prevention, child custody, child support, those kinds of things. Again, that's not because we understood that was a need. It's because our neighbors came and told us that. We have other programs. One of the major pipelines into poverty, a lot of times, like I was saying, we're kind of battling some of the misperceptions about people in poverty. And one of the misperceptions is the major pathway into poverty is substance abuse, right? That may be a major pipeline into it. When in fact, the biggest pipeline that we've discovered in our time fighting poverty is actually through the foster care system. So many of our youth that grow up in the foster care system, when they begin to transition out of that at the age of 18 with no support system and no social group and no structured family, our youth report to move an average of 10 to 12, sometimes 15 times while they're in placement. And so not having that stability and not having that support system, when you turn 18, I know when I turned 18, that wasn't a list of my greatest hits album, you know, but I still had the support system around me of a faith community, a church where I grew up, my family, my school, my after school activities. So I had all these systems that I could rely on when I wasn't at my best. And our youth that transition out of the foster care system don't often have that. because of how often they're relocated and the trust that is not built on these systems that they get to be in for whatever reasons, either because of past trauma or it's just hard connecting with people when you're relocated that often. So we have a TRACK program, Transition Resource Action Center, that works with our youth that are transitioning out of the foster care system, not only to do some preparation for adult living, but also to try to provide some rapid rehousing for them, that provide job training, that provide mentoring, that provide clothes for interviews and bus passes to get to interviews. So that's another major program that we have. Speaking of housing, we have around 750 housing units in different elements throughout Dallas. One example is we've got a 16-story building in downtown Dallas. If you're familiar with where the Y is, right there in downtown Dallas, it's right across the street from that. That's mixed income housing. The idea is we've got 30, 60, 80% market rate apartments in this building. And then we've got some lofts that some of our executive staff live in. And the idea is you're sharing an elevator in an apartment complex with someone you probably wouldn't normally, right? Because different economic brackets live in different parts of our city, which has been intentional, as we've seen, as we've discussed redlining and that whole housing crisis that happened decades and decades and decades ago, which is one of the things that we're trying to unravel and trying to overcome in our fight against poverty. So again, that's one of the best versions that we have, is not just doing economic growth in certain parts of our city, but trying to figure out how do we ride the elevator together with everybody. How does everybody have a chance to step on and live in the same space and have the same economic benefit from life and from the city and from other neighbors that we wouldn't get to share life with. So we have another neighborhood that we've built is called the Cottages at Hickory Crossing. These are tiny homes that we built about 5 years ago, right when tiny homes was starting to become a thing. They're 50 tiny homes that we built for the most chronically homeless men and women in Dallas. So there's a lot of organizations that deal with homelessness and affordable housing in Dallas. We share a list called a housing priority list, and we share this list with all these organizations. And anytime someone comes on and they need housing, they get put on this list based off of certain criteria. How often have they been homeless? How long have they been homeless? What's their risk factor? Is there substance abuse? Is there mental health issues in their past? Is there criminal records in their past? How at risk are they? And we took the top 50 people, the most at risk, the most chronically homeless, the people that cost the city of Dallas the most money every time you go to Parkland Hospital because it's 108 degrees outside, or your blood pressure or your blood sugars are all over the place. And you go to Parkland Emergency Hospital. That doesn't cost you any money. That costs the city of Dallas money. Every time Dallas police pick you up for panhandling in Deep Ellum, or every time the Dallas police clean up some of these tent encampments because it's the state fair and all these encampments don't look great to out-of-city, out-of-state visitors that are coming for something deep fried, right? So how do we, every time that happens, that costs the city of Dallas money. So the most chronically homeless men and women in Dallas cost the city about $40,000 to $45,000 a year in services just to keep them homeless. And we figured out we could actually give them a tiny home for between $13,000, $14,000, $15,000 a year. So almost a third of the cost to the city of Dallas to actually provide housing, and not just here's a key. We found it's not really helpful to hand someone a key and say good luck, because home ownership is really hard no matter where you are. It's complicated. And handing somebody a key and just saying good luck, especially someone that has been on the streets for several years or has come to distrust community, is not fair. And that's not being a good friend, and that's not being a good neighbor. So we have what's called permanent supportive housing. And this is the wraparound services that case managers, mental health workers that surround our neighbors and check on our neighbors to make sure that they're doing well and that they have friends and that they have good neighbors and that we get to model that for them. Our housing retention rate is 94%. The national average is around 60%. So 94% of people that come into our programs never return back to homelessness. Most of the time, they end up just staying with us because we have a permanent supportive housing solution, which is it's their home until they no longer want it or they're no longer with us. So sometimes some of our neighbors come to our housing programs and they get reconnected with family in another state, and then they move on to go do something else. We have some neighbors that have decided not to be good neighbors and that they just would prefer to do something else. We've had several neighbors that are just massively underserved in the mental health institutions in our state because the state of Texas is massively underfunded and there's no infrastructure for mental health institutions here in Dallas or in the state of Texas. So they just need more help than we're capable and qualified to provide. And so we've had to put them in places where they can get the help that they need. We've had several neighbors that pass away, but they died at home. And that's a big deal to us, is not just the numbers and the statistics, but the dignity and the humanity that we get to provide and that we get to restore in the work that we do. And I'll talk about that when we get to friendship side of how we fight poverty. We also have a clinic that provides services to our neighbors that are unable to get affordable health care. We have a clinic that is not far from Fair Park that has 2 full-time doctors. It's a partnership that we have with Baylor Scott & White, where they have 2 full-time doctors. We have a top-level pharmaceutical element there where our neighbors can come in. And the idea is they're seeing the same doctors. It's not like a pro bono deal where some doctors come in and give their off time. And every time you go see a doctor, it's a different person in the same white coat. These are the same doctors. This is your doctor. And they get to know you, and it's a relationship starts to form there. And the idea is we're hoping that you will be able to connect with this person so that there's trust there, so that when you make suggestions, there's enough trust there for some life change to happen. Or as the patient, I can trust that this person cares about me as a person rather than just as providing a service. So that's really important to us, and that's been a really unique model. That clinic serves people that are at or below 200% of the poverty line and the uninsured. And so these are people that would likely not get to go see a doctor at all. Like we said earlier, our neighbors that experience poverty have a lot of medical challenges oftentimes in front of them and are unable to get the resources that they need to address them. We also have a community health worker that is all over our neighborhoods, checking on our neighbors that live underneath I-45 that are doing, especially right now, a lot of COVID information and vaccine information and education on these kinds of things. A lot of our friends and neighbors, especially in the Black communities, have a distrust for the vaccination process because of stuff that's happened historically. And so getting out there and talking about those things and addressing that and valuing that and hearing that, and then trying to tell the story about health and wellness now and the importance of that now is something our Community Wellness Center does. And they're amazing. They're relentless. And they've really helped us as an organization be prepared to make all the necessary adjustments that we've had to make so that we can still provide the services that we've had to provide in the COVID era, right? One program that they did that I thought was fascinating that I want to make sure I share with you guys is our community nurse came up with the idea and understood that a lot of our neighbors might not go to the doctor and might not go to the clinic as often as they should, especially people that had things that needed to constantly be monitored, like blood pressure, for example. That's something you got to keep your eye on all the time. Well, our neighbors weren't going to the clinic as often as they should to get that monitored, but they were going to their barbers and they were going to their hairdressers and they were going to their beauticians. And so she came up with the idea of let's train our local barbers and our beauticians and our hairdressers on how to take and how to monitor and how to record blood pressure. And so when I go get my haircut, I'm sitting in the chair, hey, let me check your blood pressure real quick. There's a good chance I'm probably going to trust you and allow that to happen, especially when you've got a pair of scissors that close to my head, or there's been relationship there and I've been going to see you for that long, and you tell me this, I'm going to listen to you. There's a good chance that's there. Again, there's relationship and there's precedence and there's trust there. And when I get my blood pressure checked and my, my Marcus is the guy that cuts my hair, and he's like, hey, Matt, your blood pressure's a little high. You need to go get that looked at. That means something different coming from my buddy Marcus that cuts my hair, right? So that's been a really kind of profound, innovative solution in how to address a lot of the kind of the subtle issues of poverty. We also found out that life is a lot more intense when your friends are involved, right? And we've missed that over the last 18 months. I'm an extroverted person. I'm sitting here in the corner of my bedroom on my little desk, and I'm not, well, a lot of those extroverts are not doing well right now because we miss that proximity to people. Life is a lot more intense when your friends are involved. It's like if you've ever been to a live sports event, whether it's high school, college, or professional, you cheer differently when you're in the stands than you do when you watch it on TV. Because when you're in the stands, you're with a shared group of people. You're all there for the same reason. You draw on the energy from the people that are around you. It's in a way, it's the same when you're watching a funny movie with your friends, right? You laugh differently when you're with your friends than you do when you're by yourself watching it on your iPad at home. Because maybe you have that friend that saw something was funny that you didn't think was funny, and well, now that's funny. Or if you're like me, I've got that friend that has that really funny laugh that makes me laugh even harder. So when they start laughing, I start laughing, and then I can't stop because it's just a vicious cycle. I laugh differently when I watch funny movies with my friends than I do when I'm by myself at home on my iPad. It's the same way with how we fight poverty, which is why the friendship side of service, advocacy, and friendship is so important to how we fight poverty, because they're friends of ours and they're neighbors of ours. And you've heard me use that term, neighbors. Neighbors is what we refer to the people that we work with as. We don't call them customers. We don't call them clients. We don't call them poor people. As I said earlier, we don't even call them homeless people. We call them our friends and our neighbors and our people that experience homelessness. It's not just another term for us and them. It's what they refer to us on staff as well. This country right now is putting a lot of effort into us and them. And we're having a lot of us and them conversations right now and trying to draw a lot of us and them lines. And the reality is there is no us and them. There is only us. And we can try to boil that down. We can try to figure out, but the further away you get from ground level, there is only us. And so we're all neighbors in this neighborhood of Dallas. We all need each other to get through life together. Everybody's rich and everybody's poor, just in different ways. So that friendship side of how we fight poverty is really important. So let me tell you an example of kind of how that is a more effective and efficient way of fighting poverty instead of just a warm and fuzzy feeling that I get it comes off sounding like. For example, when the pandemic first hit, one of the things that came out was all of the schools had shut down, right? Because we couldn't go to school. And I've got three sons, one in middle school, and then my twins are elementary age. Yes, I have twin boys, and I need a hug. The school systems, when they shut down, one of the massive stories that came out, especially in the city of Dallas, was all of our students that were not getting the meals that they were getting when school was closed. Do you remember that? 90% of students, kindergarten through senior in high school, qualify for free or reduced meals in Dallas Independent School District. 9 out of 10 qualify for free or reduced meals, kindergarten through senior in high school. This includes all of Dallas Independent School District. And there's a lot of different schools within that district. There's a lot of neighborhoods in that district, and still 9 out of 10 qualify for free or reduced meals. So when the summer, when the pandemic hit, and we're all having these conversations about how do we get these meals to these kids. One of the programs that we've had for years is a summer feeding program. It's a partnership that we have with PepsiCo and their Food for Good initiative, where every day during the summer, an 18-wheeler shows up from Pepsi, and our team of AmeriCorps members, AmeriCorps is kind of the domestic version of the Peace Corps. We have about 75 AmeriCorps members that go unload these meals from PepsiCo. We put them on about a dozen of our food trucks, and then we go on routes all across Dallas every single day for the summer and make about 7 or 8 stops along that route that we've established throughout the year. These are partner sites, public libraries, community centers, apartment complexes, those kinds of things. So over the course of the year, we've established these partner sites, and our AmeriCorps members go to each of these stops along their route and deliver meals to kids that are not getting their meals. Now, this is something that we've been doing for every single summer for the last decade or so, because food insecurity is a pandemic that we don't really talk about in the city of Dallas. COVID is almost all we talk about right now, but this issue of food insecurity has been an ongoing pandemic for many of our neighbors and many of our kids in our neighborhood and in the city of Dallas that we have not talked about. And so when the pandemic hit, we were able to shift that program in a matter of about a weekend to get these meals to these schools while the school districts were trying to figure out, how do we do this? And that's not a knock on the school districts. It's because we've been doing this for so long. We knew how to do it. We had all the relationships there, and we were able to step in before anybody else really had any idea of what to do. Again, it's not because we're the experts in it. It's because our neighbors have told us, this is a real issue that my kid is facing during the summers. How do we get them something to eat? The friendship side of, I promise you the friendship side of how this works is, when we first started to do this, there's a stigma that comes from being food insecure. Francie read in my bio that I did the food pantry operation for about 3 years, and I could always tell when somebody was new to the food pantry, because a lot of times, unfortunately, they would come in and feeling embarrassed by it. Maybe have a low ball cap, some sunglasses on, something like that. Not that they needed to be embarrassed, because we all need help. But there was a stigma that comes from being food insecure. And the unfortunate reality is that extends to a lot of our youth that are food insecure as well. So even though our AmeriCorps members early on in the summer feeding program would show up and with these meals that are great from Pepsi and their Food for Good initiative, the kids would not come out of their apartment complex because they were embarrassed. And so our team came up with this idea of, let's take sidewalk chalk and hula hoops and soccer balls and a Bluetooth speaker. And hey, we're hanging out. And while we're hanging out, do you want something to eat? And now these kids started to come out and our numbers skyrocketed. Again, it's not because of this innovative thing. It's because friendship is a better way of getting through life together. And so that's an example of kind of how it's more effective and more efficient way of fighting poverty. And advocacy, like I said, service, advocacy, and friendship. Advocacy is standing up for people and standing beside people. So sometimes it's elevating our voices, which is, something that I'm learning a lot about as a white male right now in our country is, how do I elevate my voice? What do I speak on the platforms that I've been given, not just at work, but in my personal life? And as Francie read in my bio, I live in Coppell, which is near DFW Airport. So I've got feet in two very different neighborhoods. And how do I be a good neighbor where I am here in Coppell? And then how do I be a good neighbor in Deep Ellum where I work, just outside of Deep Ellum where I work, which is challenging because sometimes the best thing I can do to be an ally and to be an advocate is to stop talking and to listen, and to let other voices be heard right now, and to let other voices carry the weight and the value and the truth of things. And so one thing that we've really tried to do, I'll send a link at some point, is we've developed a racial justice and social equity resource page, because a lot of our country is really starting to wrestle with conversations and things that they've never talked about before and have been able to avoid because of little bubbles or being sheltered or not having to face a lot of those conversations due to privilege, due to lack of proximity, those kinds of things. So we developed a racial justice social equity page where we have all kinds of resources that are on there, books, podcasts, films to watch, those kinds of things that are safe, that are trusted, that will help understand what kinds of conversations, what do we need to be having as a society, as a city, as a neighborhood, as individuals. And so that's something that's really important as well, because if we're going to address this issue of poverty, the reality is we should have solved it by now. in our country, one of the wealthiest countries in the history of our species. The way that we were able to get to the moon with so little technology in the 60s, we should have been able to solve poverty right now, but we haven't. And I think it's because we haven't been able to sit down and have conversations about what the real issue is and has been. And that's something that we have to do very delicately. That's something that we have to, you can't lead people places they don't want to go. And so that's something that we've been really careful of. And that's why opportunities like this are really important, to be able to come in and step into these sacred spaces and have conversations and tell the story about what poverty is like and what life is like for a lot of our neighbors that we don't really know are there, or we don't know is a reality for them. The unique thing about the pandemic is it affected all of us, right? And especially when that winter storm came through, there was no amount of affluence you could have that could isolate you from that experience. If you were in the state of Texas, that affected all of us. And so when we get to talk about one of the pathways into poverty is just life dealt you a really bad set of cards, and life threw you a curveball that you were not prepared for. The only benefit of the pandemic and that freeze is that story's a lot more accessible now than it used to be. And there are a lot of our friends that were just barely hanging on, that got two curveballs thrown at them pretty in quick succession, and are now put in a situation that they never thought they would be at. Our food pantry operation, which went from a client choice grocery store model outside of COVID to a drive-through model due to COVID restrictions, went from about 180, 190 to 200 households a day that were served at our food pantry to over 500. And a third of the people in the first 6 to 9 months that were coming to the CitySquare food pantry had reported never been to a food pantry before. And so it's astonishing what that did to a lot of our neighbors and a lot of our friends in the city of Dallas. It's important to understand we are just now, especially from a food insecurity stage, we are just right before the pandemic, we were just starting to recover from the 2008 recession. There are studies about how long that recession took, and the damage that did over time. We just now got over that. So imagine what the recovery process is going to look like from COVID and from the winter freeze for a lot of our neighbors. So that's why your friendship is so important, because we are in this fight for the long haul, because it is going to take a long time to deal with these issues, to address these issues, to stand with our neighbors as they walk through this, and to have people that support them. And that's just going to be really important. I'll leave you with kind of one final story. I see some things coming up in the chat, and I do want to make sure we get a chance to get to those. As far as advocacy goes, when I was running our food pantry operation, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson, at the time, was on his listening tour once he was appointed under that administration, and went kind of throughout the country on a listening tour, meeting organizations that dealt with housing and urban development. CitySquare being one of those because of our presence in the housing and affordable housing and homelessness issues. So one day we knew he was coming. He shows up with a black motorcade. They pull up into our parking lot. About half a dozen gentlemen got out with the black suit, sunglasses, the little plastic ear twirly thing. And he gets out and takes a tour of our campus with our CEO, Larry James, and our president and COO, John Seibert, who's now the CEO. And they walked through our facility, and they took a tour, and I was 4 feet away from him as he walked through our food pantry. At the very end of the whole thing, they're sitting there and they're talking about the work that we do, and he's got some questions just about the facility and that kind of a thing. If you're familiar with Deep Ellum and you know where Deep Ellum Brewery is, we are just on the other side of that bridge. So as soon as you cross that bridge into Deep Ellum, the neighborhood changes drastically. But on our side, things are not as gentrified as Deep Ellum has become. And so it's a bit of a rough neighborhood. We're right by Austin Street Shelter, if you're familiar with Austin Street. Anyway, so some of our neighbors here know that something big is going on at CitySquare. And a couple of our neighbors are wanting to come and talk to this important person. A couple of them knew who he was. And the Secret Service had kind of protected him, like created this little bubble so that, because they're Secret Service and that's what they do. And one of our neighbors wanted to talk to Mr. Carson. And Larry James knew this person, because if you know Larry, he knows our neighbors. And so Larry reaches over, grabs the neighbor's arm, breaks the circle, breaks the bubble, pulls him in, and he goes, and I was not far away, and I heard it, and I will never forget it. And he said, Mr. Carson, if you're on a national listening tour, this is the person you need to listen to. And gave this person an opportunity to talk. And I will never forget that. Because that is not just our leader, he's our founder. He's the moral compass for who we are. He's the example of how people come first, to an extent that it makes maybe some systems uncomfortable. And we're not afraid to break the bubble, to burst the bubble when we need to, because that friendship is our secret sauce at CitySquare. There's a lot of people that do a lot of good and may not necessarily give a damn, if I can say that, because they're friends of ours. They have names, they have stories, they have favorite places to go eat, they have birthdays where they hope they get a present and they hope that they're acknowledged. They have dreams, they have aspirations, they have insects that they're afraid of. And that is our secret sauce. It's not because we have best practices nailed down. We're not afraid of failure because we failed so many times. We know the benefit of it and how we can learn from it and how we can adapt from it. It's because the people that experience poverty are friends of ours and they're neighbors of ours. On the flip side of that, having conversations like this, you're friends and neighbors of ours as well. That's not, again, just a term that we refer to people that are struggling financially through life. You're friends and you're neighbors of ours. And we're so thankful for you, and we're thankful for your contributions. We're thankful for your advocacy in your circles and in your neighborhoods, as well as you hear kind of stories about what we do. And as your awareness is raised on the issue of poverty and the social justice, racial equity issues as well. When you hear those, I hope that you listen to those, and I hope that you understand how that affects so many of our neighbors in the city of Dallas. And so that is a very kind of 30,000 foot. Hopefully it wasn't too in depth. There's a lot of me talking, so hopefully there's some questions in here that we do want to get to, or if there's any questions or thoughts or comments that you would like to have. It doesn't just have to be Q&A. I'd like this to be organic if there's conversations we'd like to have together. So let's see.
Jennifer,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Both Jennifer and I are also part of MetroTex as well as CCAR. And Jennifer, go ahead and ask your question.
I was just wondering, I live in California, and the only homeless organization that I'm aware of is in, and I'm just wondering, does CitySquare partner similar organizations, and if so, to what extent and which ones?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jennifer. I actually grew up in Allen, so I'm familiar with Collin County. I grew up in Allen before it became Allen. So for example, our track program that works with foster youth covers 19 counties in region, I believe it's region 3. And that is all the way up to the Oklahoma border and then as far west as Stephenville. So like our track program is in all of these other counties. So that's one program that we have that is kind of all over the place. We do work with places like the Samaritan Inn. I mentioned Austin Street Emergency Shelter. They are literally around the corner from us. We will never be an emergency shelter because there are organizations that do that and do that really well. And there is a need for that, but there's also a need for organizations like CitySquare that kind of do everything else, so that we can deal with housing, so that we can deal with case management, health, we can deal with hunger. And so places like the Samaritan Inn, Salvation Army, United Way, the Bridge, Stew Pot, like they're all friends of ours. We all need, that's one thing I've really enjoyed is there's not really like a turf war of social services in CitySquare. We're like, oh, that we do that. Why would you do that? It's like, no, like I remember at the food pantry, I would send people to other food pantries so that they could get as much food as possible. And I knew people that ran other food pantries. It's the same way with our housing and health and our other programs as well. So I don't know specifically what all's in Collin County right now, but I know that we do work with organizations like that.
Wonderful. I wasn't aware of the track program before this call, and I think that's wonderful. It's tragic that children are put out with no resources.
Yeah, it's hard. We've heard stories of, are you saying when they turned 18, they were pretty much given a trash bag of their stuff, a bus pass, and a phone number. And so,
is that how it works? Is that true? Is that pretty much how it works?
That's been the truth for several of our youth, because they didn't have a support system, and so when they aged out, that was really it. And that is a true story from a couple of people that I know. We are on, fortunately, we've been doing it long enough where we're on speed dial for CPS. And so when someone is considered at risk and they're close to aging out, we're in the loop before they get to that moment. But that's not always been the case, especially early on in the life of our track program. We would hear those stories about the trash bag and the bus pass. So fortunately, we've been doing it long enough and effectively enough where we get a phone call before we get to that moment most of the time.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
The one question we had, I know especially, and you definitely brought to light just the need for hunger. And my husband and I have a catering company, so I'm used to feeding people, and no one should go hungry.
Right.
That is, I don't think people realized how, like you said, how on the edge. And I'm also involved with other organizations, and I had several friends of mine when we were talking about some parts of South Dallas that they didn't realize that it was a food desert. They didn't know what a food desert was. And I don't think people realize that sometimes, and I remember this news special years ago, that it was cheaper to eat unhealthy than it was cheaper to eat healthy. And I know I was listening to Michelle Obama's book, and that was one of the things that she did as her initiative as the First Lady, is she wanted to teach people how to garden, how to take care, how they can grow and to feed themselves, and just educate people on the value of nutrition.
Yeah, so that was, that was one thing I really, that was learning from drinking from a fire hydrant for me. When I went from student ministry into running our food pantry operation, the joke I like to use is when I was a student minister, the only type of food distribution I had to worry about is how many pizzas do I need to order for the Super Bowl party. And then to move into our food pantry operation where, we're distributing up to 5.5 million pounds of food over a 3-year period. That was a learning curve. And one of the things I had to learn about was, what does food insecurity even mean? And what is a food desert? Because I'd always grown up in a place, especially in Collin County and Allen, where I could get to about 8 or 9 grocery stores in about 10 minutes worth of driving. So not only was there a grocery store, but I had options, and I had places that I could pick, and I could kind of hop around between what's on sale and what's not on sale. And if, Brookshire's didn't have what I was looking for, I could hop over to Albertsons. Well, in South Dallas especially, there's none of those, because companies are they're not taking the risk on putting in a good establishment there if there's not other organizations as well. No one wants to be first in on a neighborhood like that. And so that's one thing that we've really tried to figure out, is how do we take certain parts of our sector and our city, and how do we be the first ones in? Is there a way that we could do that, where we could open a grocery store? And instead, our neighbors are relying on like these convenience stores where everything is marked up, and they're all processed foods. Running our food pantry, when we would do surveys for our neighbors, which we did every year, there was a deep desire for and appreciation of healthy and organic food from our neighbors. Even though they may not necessarily know exactly what to do with it, they knew it was important, they knew it was healthy, and they knew it was expensive. And so that was something that we always tried to pursue when I was running the food pantry operation, was having that available for our neighbors. Now, that doesn't mean we were like a vegan food pantry or whatever. I mean, I would never turn down a pallet of double stuffed Oreos because some days you just need a dozen of them, right? Especially if you have kids and twins, you need a cookie. And so we would have those for our neighbors as well. But yeah, we would pick up food from North Texas Food Bank is a big friend of ours. We couldn't do what we do without them. We pick up from several different Sam's in the area, Whole Foods, Sprouts, Kroger, Trader Joe's. So a lot of times stuff that was on the shelf yesterday is in our food pantry today. One program I do want to talk about real quickly, speaking of food, is not only do we have our food distribution license, and the inspector comes from the city of Dallas, we also have our food salvage license as a food pantry. We're one of the only ones that has that. It's a whole other additional set of standards. And what that means is we can take big bulk items, like big bags of flour or big bags of rice. We can repackage them, relabel them, and redistribute them with our name on it, which is a big deal because a lot of times we get a big bag of flour and it's like, we can't put this in somebody's car, but we can take it, we can hand that and give that out. What that also means is within the last 18 months, we've developed a food recovery program. So Shannon, like you were talking about reducing food waste, especially from a catering side, what we can do is we can actually take, we have a development team, a research and development team for our food program that takes these big bulk items that we get and they make individual meals out of them. Shepherd's pie, what was another one? Chicken pot pie, enchiladas, all kinds of things they make, and they put them in these little 3 to 5 pound meals. They blast freeze them, and then they're heat and eat meals that we can distribute to our neighbors. That can be done in an oven, in a microwave, over a campfire, which is a big deal for our neighbors that experience homelessness. And then we also distribute these to partner organizations, Stew Pot, The Bridge, Samaritan Inn, like we hand those out to other organizations. So that's one way that we've been able to reduce food waste. The food is incredible. I don't know how they do what they do when you don't really know what you're going to get ingredients wise until you pull it off the truck. But that's been a really amazing program and an innovative way of how we've had to try to meet this need of food insecurity, especially with so many of the restaurant hospitality industry being hit so hard from COVID and so many people being laid off and out of work. That's been a big deal.
Yeah, I know a lot of our staff that we have work part-time with us that were typically working full-time in hotels, and that was one of the things, especially when they shut down, they didn't have jobs, and then that affects their how they're getting food, how they're getting to go places. And it was just, for some people that may not realize, it's truly can be life-changing, and it can be done that quickly.
Mm-hmm. Let me get to a couple of these questions real quick. The urban myth is folks want to live on the streets. Do you have ambassadors who choose to live on the streets but are support team? There are people that choose to live on the streets, and we have to honor that and we have to value that. There's people that choose to live in the city of Dallas instead of Colorado Springs, Colorado, or Vermont. There's just people that choose to live in different places in different situations, and some people choose to live on the streets. When I was first learning about homelessness and housing, it was explained to me taking somebody off the streets that's been on the streets for several years and putting them in a home with the responsibilities and just that completely different setting can be as destabilizing as taking somebody like me that grew up in the homes and putting them on the streets. It can be a lot. And so there are neighbors that choose to live on the streets and just choose to live in that lifestyle. And we have to honor that and we have to value that. We have a homeless outreach team as part of our case manager service. We call it Neighbor Support Services. And what they do is we have an RV, a big camper, that we've ripped the bed out of and have put in a desk. And so we drive to a lot of these encampments that are spread out all throughout Dallas. Our neighbors that experience homelessness are nomadic and do tend to move around quite a bit, especially in the fall when the city of Dallas is kind of ramping up their camp closings, whatever it is. I forgot the word. Closing down these encampments is what I was looking for. And especially, like I said, with COVID, it's been hard to keep up with them anyway because they can't get to us as easily. So we have a homeless outreach team that goes to these encampments twice a week and checks on our neighbors. We don't have any that necessarily live on the streets in the encampments, but we do have staff that live in other housing units in different apartment complexes. So I mentioned we have 750. We've got the 50 tiny homes, and then we've got different apartment complexes that we're working with the building management to make sure that they will accept Section 8 housing vouchers and those kinds of things. So that is kind of an answer to your question. We don't necessarily have some that live in there, but are very present neighbors in that space. What volunteer opportunities do you have? We have several. I highly recommend the food pantry operation. That's what I did as a volunteer for about a year before I transitioned over to CitySquare, where they asked if I would work it. It's a very low barrier for entry. Right now, it is a neat experience because everyone that comes and receives services at CitySquare is asked if they want to volunteer with us at CitySquare. I want to tell you a story real quick to kind of close and kind of all along that note, because we can't do what we do without our volunteers. One day, Larry James was at our old location off of Haskell. He was conducting a food pantry intake process where he was trying to get someone's information that they wanted to provide so we could put them in the system, see what their need is, and then make sure that we could address it as best possible. Larry was sitting at one side of the table. It was a young Hispanic woman and her family were sitting on the other side of the table, and there was a language barrier there. She didn't speak much English. Larry speaks almost zero Spanish, so they were at an impasse, and he couldn't communicate with her, and she couldn't communicate with him. Well, right at that time, an older woman walks out of the food pantry and sees what is going on. She had just gone through the intake process herself. She is bilingual and can speak both English and Spanish. She understands what's going on. She's been a part of CitySquare for a little while. And she says, "Mr. Larry, would you like me to help?" And he said, "Yes, please. Would you come over and help me with this?" Well, she ended up not just translating the intake process. She did the entire interview herself because she had just gone through it. And so her name was Josefina Ortiz. And so she conducts this interview, is able to get the family the food that they need and the services that they need. And as she's walking out, Larry's, so appreciative. And he said, "Thank you so much. We couldn't, I couldn't do that without you." And she says, "Would you like me to come back tomorrow?" And he said, "Yes, I would love that. Please come back tomorrow." And Miss Ortiz came back tomorrow for the next 9 years.